Well, welcome everybody to our webinar today with Mark Adams. I'm really pleased to have you here. You might have heard me chit-chatting before about how I'm in Florida on vacation in the Florida Keys, and there's the hint right there in that picture. And meanwhile, Mark is in Truro, where he tells me that it's still snowing. So those of you who are in Truro, stay safe and dry, and those of you who are not, I hope that you're enjoying fine weather. So I want to welcome you all, and I want to thank you for your support of this webinar series. My name is Susan Howe. I'm the president of the board of the Truro Historical Society. And for those of you who don't know, the Truro Historical Society manages both the Highland House Museum and the Cobb Archive. The museum is open in the season from June 1st to September 30th. From Monday through Saturday. We're closed on Sunday. And the Cobb Archive is open all year round. The museum is where we have a lot of objects that you can see and paintings on the walls, but the archive, which is located in a building in Truro Center that used to be the Cobb Library. It was the first public library in town. And that's where we store our works on paper, like maps and photographs and books and things like that. So I hope that you will visit us at both places, at the Highland House in the summer and at the Cobb Archive all year round. This webinar, as all of ours, are free, but we appreciate donations, and you can make those donations on our website. And along with donations, we hope you'll consider becoming a member. Some of the benefits of membership include free unlimited access to the Highland House Museum and Cobb Archive, special member events, discounts at our museum store, and most importantly, knowing that you're among our most valued supporters. This webinar, which Mark is going to host for us, is called Past and Future Landscapes of Truro and the Outer Cape. And it will run for about 45 minutes where Mark will talk with us, and then we will take questions and answers. And if you can look at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat function. And if some of you have found it already, and if you haven't, if you can just press that button, and then you can write something into the chat. And at the end of Mark's talk, we'll go through them and we'll try to answer as many as we can. So first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Mark. If you haven't heard him speak, or which he has done several times at the Highland House Museum, he is recently retired as the cartographer and coastal geologist with the Cape Cod National Seashore. Although he's still working on projects with them, he's officially retired. He's an environmental artist in New England and elsewhere, and has come to the Cape in 1991. And became a Truro resident in 1999. Now he's an artist in residence at the Center for Coastal Studies. He exhibits at the Schoolhouse Gallery, and he also does volunteer work in a whole other area with immigrant and asylum issues in the Mediterranean and at the Mexican border since 2019. His special interest is in visualizing human well-being in the context of ecological systems and natural processes. So I am really pleased to present Mark, and you can take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. And I just want to acknowledge from the start that when I speak to an audience in Truro, I'm always keenly aware that there's a lot of experts in the audience. And so I'm going to try and thread the conversation to a level where I'll probably be telling you some things that you already know. And but, you know, also, I'm sure there are people here who might not be in Truro and might be, you know, part of the Cape Cod community, you know, from a farther distance away. So anyway, I'm going to share my slides. Also, I wanted to, let's see, share screen. Here we go. Here we go. Okay. And yeah, I think the questions will be in the chat. and maybe Susan will curate those as we go along. I've given talks like this that are more of a more technical nature. I want to be a little speculative today and expand the whole boundaries of this question of landscape and the forces of landscape change and where we might be going beyond that. And I also want to acknowledge my longtime collaborators at the Cape Cod National Seashore, and Graham Geis and Mark Borelli at the Center for Coastal Studies, who are responsible for a lot of the ideas here. I could not do any of this by myself. But so anyway, let's start. Let's really go back and start. I was in Morocco a while ago, and I realized that some of the geology maps refer to some of the same geologic features in Morocco that are in New England. And that's because, if I click on this, because of plate tectonics, because New England was at some point a neighbor of North Africa. So there's this base of geology on which the performance takes place. There's this long term, and it also opens up your mind to the idea of timescales. You know, this is a 140 million year timescale. And then we'll be talking about the 20,000 year timescale, which is really very up to date and relevant to how the Cape is formed. And then we'll be talking about the century scale time scale. Let's actually, here it is. Okay, so understanding the landscape in time, you know, on the order of 100 million years in geologic time, we have the continent, the drifting continents. And then on the scale of 10,000 years, 22,000 years to 10,000 years ago, we have glacial time. This is really the forces that created the mutable landforms of Cape Cod. And one thing I want to throw in here that's not often used as a marker in time is native time. First people arrived in New England, in parts of North America, somewhere 12,000 years or more. There's evidence from that time period in museums, but there's also narratives and traditions that date it back farther. But, you know, it's interesting to think that humans, native people, the first people were here observing these geologic processes and living in it. And then, you know, there's the scale of centuries. There's colonial time, the pilgrims, the several centuries of European settlement on the Cape. And then let's throw inside that, this is like Russian dolls, right? They're getting smaller and smaller. And the next doll inside is the industrial time, the time when they invented the internal combustion engine and fossil fuels were being burned. And we're in that time. Maybe we're nearing a turning point in that time. But then as we jump to the future, most of the goals around climate change are about when can we reach net zero emissions of greenhouse gases to the environment. And if we can do that.
Excuse me, Mark, for a second.
Yeah.
Are you supposed to be advancing your slides? Because we aren't seeing them advance.
Oh, you can, let's see. See, do you see? Well, I'm on. It should say understanding the landscape in time.
No, it's on your cover slide. It says past and future landscapes.
Goodness. Because yes, I am advancing them. Huh. All right, your screen.
Well,
is paused. Your screen sharing is paused. What does that mean? Is there a?
I'm going to have it follow your.
Here we go. How about this?
Okay. Someone suggests you click play.
Yeah, it is. It's playing. I am playing. Oh, Jesus. Excuse me.
That's all right. We all understand technical difficulties. Someone says on top you should click play. Maybe I can.
No, well, I mean, I'm playing it on my desktop.
Yes, and I have it set so
like, for example, is the animation now I've gone. When I do this, does the little picture become animated?
No.
No?
No.
Interesting.
Let's see, side by side speaker. Let's see if that changes anything.
I'm going to stop sharing and start again.
Okay.
Stop. And now I'm going to share again, share. And
someone thinks you've chosen the wrong. Oh, good. I see something better now.
okay.
Very good. Thank you.
So is that advancing?
Yes, now it is advancing.
Okay, great. Sorry for that.
Great. No problem.
So I just went through this summary slide, all these words from geologic time, glacier time, native time, colonial time, industrial time, and then the future, which starts with net zero in our very near future, if we can achieve it. And then one thing that is never talked about is what happens after that. So, again, I just challenge you to think about time in more than just what we can document in a season or in years of history. And we'll try to look at that a little bit. Again, just one more view of the dividing continents to show you the location of New England, North Africa, and how we split. And the result of that is that the edge of the continent is not at the shelf. It's not at the Gulf of Maine. It's not nearby. The edge of our continent is the mid-Atlantic ridge. And this is all new land being exposed as the continents divide apart along that ridge. This is New England here. And so that means that we live on a passive continental margin. It's a platform made of this ocean crust that's spreading from the middle of the Atlantic. But on top of that is this layer of highly dynamic frosting, this sediment, the sand that moves, and also the glacial plain till that moves. So that's our kind of layer cake of what all these changes are built on, right? This passive continental margin. So just a quick recap: the glaciers retreated over the course of, by say 10, 12,000 years ago. Here we see looking east, the Cape emerging from two lobes of the glaciers. And those two lobes are very important because that division between the two lobes is where the glaciers paused and the meltwater spread out the layers of soil that created our coastal plains. East End plains, Wellfleet plains, they're not moraines, they're plains. So they're somewhat sorted sediments, but they've never been in the ocean after the glaciers. They're terrestrial. So, and then here's the final retreat. So the other thing that had to happen in order for those glaciers to retreat is sea level rose dramatically. So in the course of those thousands of years, as you see on the bottom axis, up until about 6,000 years, sea level rose about 400 feet. And imagine if you go out on your beach and on your walk and look out at the ocean, and imagine the ocean retreating 400 feet and the land that would be open if that happened. Again, another view of the lobes of the glaciers. And another really cool thing is these glacial Lake Cape Cod was impounded fresh water in Cape Cod Bay that was trapped by the glacier front. And there was also a glacial Lake Stellwagen offshore. And the result of that is these lake bottom sediments that we now see. If you walk along the beach after a big storm, and you'll see these hockey pucks, these big flat pieces of peat, and that are basically the lake bottom sediments from this time when it was a freshwater lake. Let's see, there's another view of the ice sheet and the plains being created in front of the ice sheet. And I did this map on the left that was in the Cape Cod Museum of Art, blown up really big. But if you look closely, you'll see the white is the shoreline, current shoreline. There's Cape Cod. And the yellow and orange is what the shoreline would have been when sea level was 200 feet lower at about the time when the first humans came. So when people came, sea level was changing. There was this huge plain. Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket are out here, just hills on this vast coastal plain. And the other thing I put on here are representations of some of the megafauna, these animals that were going extinct at the same time humans were arriving. So we had mastodons, we had mammoths, we had walruses, giant bears. They were all part of the wildlife of this area. And George's Bank was an island. We don't know exactly. We do know that fishermen bring up the teeth of mastodons and the stumps of trees all the time from that period. And then out here would be the continental shelf. So this is another snapshot of time. And so this also, that vast period of time where we don't have written records. I love this book, Dawnland Voices. It's an anthology of indigenous writing. And I'm just going to read a paragraph from that for me evokes some of these changes and might be a kind of ancestral memory of how the landscape changed. And this is from Helen Adequin and Aquinawampanoag. I'll just read it. Along the marshes of Nauset on Cape Cod, over the dunes and through the forest, Moshup and his wife Squant and their people walked with the rising sun. The sun guided them toward land which was new. The shorebirds flew up ahead of them. Pheasant and deer looked on with wonder and scurried into hiding behind bayberry, sumac, viburnum, and windswept oaks. At last, Moshup slowly dragged one huge foot, and water rushed inland in a pool that formed behind him. The pool deepened and became a channel, and the tide swept in to separate a portion of the land. That land became an island separated from Cape Cod by blue water. And so this is sort of a metaphoric story, to my mind, of sea level rising and creating these landforms that we're familiar with. And I think we need every story and piece of evidence we can to incorporate the indigenous landscape story into our story. And there's another fragment here from John Bear Mitchell at the University of Maine Wabanaki Center, who talks about paddling and wondering why everyone travels by land. And that's a clue to me that at this time, humans living in this landscape must have been incredible seafarers. Even if all they had was dugout canoes, they had to be able to navigate these waterways. It was quite a water landscape over those thousands of years. So a couple of things to think about. So again, here's a sketch of what the landscape might have been at the retreat of the glaciers with the east-west valleys that were created or at least carved out by differences in water levels between the inner Cape and the outer Cape that flooded through these east-west hollows, the hollows that define the outer Cape. And also, what was the landscape? What would it look like if we had strolled the landscape just after the glaciers? And this is an alpine plant. It's an alpine rose, the Dryas octopetala, an 8-petal rose that was a low-growing vine. And it's just symbolic of the alpine, it was a boreal climate at that time. Not only were there those low-growing plants, but there was also kind of a spruce, northern spruce forest that might be familiar much further north in Maine and in Canada, which was gradually replaced by our pitch pine oak forests, which are, constantly negotiating with each other for dominance. The other important factor is to realize that the Cape is in the middle of the Gulf of Maine. And a lot of people know this, some don't, but when we look out from the Cape, we're not looking at Europe, we're not looking at the Atlantic Ocean, we're looking at the Gulf of Maine, and we would see Nova Scotia. And this is a sort of a shelf, a basin in the Northern Atlantic that has its own circulation and waves that have an effect on how erosion works, how the shoreline changes. But as sea level rises in the open ocean, we'll get more and more waves coming across this very shallow Georges Bank. And those are drivers for reshaping Cape Cod. And that's an effect we're seeing right now of climate change and sea level rise, is the increase in southeast waves coming across Georges Bank with more energy that actually shifts the direction. More and more sand is moving northward. East Ham, Orleans are getting more erosion. It's accelerating a bit, and more sand is moving northwards than is moving southwards. And that, so you can almost see it in action in a picture like this. With those southeast waves, this is Truro, Longnook, and these cusps, each one is sort of a little cycle of waves. And where that goes is the yellow pieces of our geologic map are the places where the sand that's taken from the glacial cliffs becomes from being land soils, it becomes marine soils, and it's reworked by the ocean and deposited in the direction of currents. Little sketch. And you can see it moving in these forms, these J-bars and hooks in Truro. And a while ago, Greg Berman from Woods Hole did this map showing the arrows, showing the direction of this river of sand that moves along the shoreline. Now, since he made this in 2011, we have seen a change in this division between north and south movement of sand to down closer to Nauset Light and Coast Guard in East Ham. And we think that's because of the increase in wave energy coming over Georges Bank and moving more sand northward. And the Center for Coastal Studies has done a lot of work to map this sediment river on the inner shores of Cape Cod as well. So I don't know that part as well. It's a little more complicated, but suffice it to say that if without that conveyor belt, that river of sand, we would not have any beaches. But every time you see a long spit, this is looking south at Monomoy, this is looking north at Provincetown, that's the result of this erosion conveyor belt that's feeding beaches and creating new land. And so here's just a little quick example of this energy from waves. A cubic meter of seawater is about a ton. Hits the shore. Waves come, especially the waves that come over Georges Bank, have a longer time period, a longer period. So we use the marker of 6 seconds per wave. That means 14,000 waves a day, 5 million waves a year. And that moves approximately 500,000 cubic yards of sand per year. Now, when you're on your blanket on the beach, reading your book, from now on, you have to imagine that every hour there's 4 dump trucks moving by with sand, the equivalent of 4 trucks of sand moving by as in that seemingly peaceful place. So it's an engine. The ocean is an engine of sand movement. And so how do we know all of this? I worked with the Center for Coastal Studies and Graham Geist to create these profiles of the coast. These are cross sections that we measure with surveying and GPS. We measure the elevations. And luckily, Henry Merendon was a coastal surveyor who came to Cape Cod in the 1880s and 90s and established these cross sections. And so with Dr. Geist, we can go out and reoccupy the same cross sections, and we can tell how much sand has moved in a century, which is huge. That's a huge window in time into the trend. So we owe him a great debt of gratitude. He came and he'd buy we have, we have his notebooks, and we know he would buy lumber and hire a cart, and his wife stayed in a ripped up Civil War tent on the Pamet while he was out surveying, and his dorymen were getting depths. And it's quite dramatic how science was done in that time. And he looked forward to his train trips back to DC so he could go to the theater and drink claret. So just a few examples of coastal slumping on the bluffs. This is potential energy. This sand is destined for the beach and into that river of sand. Stairways that get washed away. There's no surprise in that. Now this energy moves in spurts. It moves in storms. There could be years that go by where places don't seem to change at all. And then these big storms. Steve McHugh of the Center for Coastal Studies has plotted a number of storms, known storms, in the last couple centuries, and there's some big ones. But these are the big markers of change, is this storm. On average, we know from these long records that we know the trend. We know it very, with a high degree of certainty, how what's going to happen on the scale of decades and centuries. But each individual storm might be very dramatic, as you know. Okay. And then, so now that sea level stabilized down to this background rate of about a foot per century for the last 200 years, or 3 millimeters per year. This is our background rate. It's highly variable. It's impossible to tell week to week what the long-term trend of sea level rise is, because water's moving around in response to a lot of forces. Anyway, we'll go more about that later. But what are the forces that change the land? We have the ocean effects, which include salt blasting that affects what plants can grow where. We have the storms we mentioned. We have fire, and we have land use. And at the moment, snapshot in time, the Cape is made up of these upland ecosystems, which is about half of the land in the national seashore. You can see the green areas of woodland, heathland, and grassland. These are the habitats. These determine what plants and animals live here. And we have these beaches, barriers, islands, and dunes that are built by those forces of waves and constantly changing. Very important ponds, wetlands, streams, and groundwater. And I think this is an area that that climate change will have a surprising effect on. Things like what will happen to the ponds if they get warmer and they don't turn over each year, if they don't stratify. What will happen to groundwater? Groundwater floats on top of seawater. It may rise with the seawater, but with changes in storms and rain recharge, the groundwater levels might change in unpredictable ways. And then our tidal waters, estuaries, salt marshes. There's lots of efforts going on right now to sort of steward the estuaries and marshes. And marshes are highly vulnerable to change because Spartina, the salt marsh hay and salt marsh grass, cordgrass, they inhabit an elevation range that's just within a few inches of change in the tides. So if sea level rises quickly, if within Pleasant Bay or within Nauset Marsh, we have a big increase in a short amount of time, these plants can't migrate fast enough, and we'll get a big die-off of marshes. Why do we care about marshes? I'm sure you guys would all tell me that they're nursery grounds for shellfish and fish, and they're storm buffers. They're part of a healthy ocean ecosystem. So the other thing that's going on through the seashore and other places, both locally at the state, is trying to put these estuaries and salt marshes, such as the Herring River and Wellfleet, into better working order so they can maintain themselves, and so that we can take advantage of the work that nature does, driving tides in and out, flushing, bringing nutrients, creating a habitat that, and we'll have oysters, and we won't have the same populations of mosquitoes if we get tidal flushing in these systems. Let's see. We're also concerned about the Kettle Pond shorelines, which are trampled and being subject to warming. And there's a delicate fringe of plants that grow in that zone. So shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about land use history. Let's talk about there was a huge increase in intensity of use of the land when the Europeans came. This is a view from the margin of one of the map atlases from the 1700s, the DeBar's Atlantic Neptune. And this is the view that people offshore would get of the Cape as they arrived, these white cliffs. It's very characteristic. This is a piece of that DeBar's Atlantic Neptune. There's a few copies of it in archives. It's one of the first good maps of the Cape, and it has a lot of interesting stuff. We'll talk about these Wellfleet Islands, the Pamet River, whether or not there was a connection here between Woodend and Long Point, and then the Old Harbor break in Chatham. All these little changes that we see now are not necessarily surprises because they were on the maps in the old days. I happened to, last year I happened to stop by Mystic and see the Mayflower 2 being refitted. And it's just sort of a symbol of what's to come for New England at that time. It's really amazing to think of this little vehicle bringing so much change. And, you know, already here, Provincetown is a bustling metropolis of salt works, which were hugely consumptive of forests because you needed to feed them wood to burn. And it's just the beginning of very quaint, you know, you could put this on your tea towels, but it's really an industrial view. There's a view of that. And it has huge implications for what the land looks like. So some of the best maps of Cape Cod, many of you are aware of, are these coastal survey maps that range from 1836 to 1868. They worked their way down the coast. It was kind of project initiated by Thomas Jefferson and with technology from Lewis and Clark, but very excellent surveys that were the basis of navigation maps, but they also show us the vegetation and land use and field boundaries and wetlands at the time. And one thing here, let's see, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but what I'm going to refer to later, these colored areas that I colored in are the areas where forest remained in 1848, because as you know, the Cape was mostly cleaned, devegetated, everything was in use. And here's a quick example. Typical colonial house used about 40 cords of wood per year, which was about 1 decent acre of woodlot. The 1790 census, let's say it's rounded to 4,500 families, 4,500 people, 800 some families on the Outer Cape. And I'm not sure now where I got this estimate, but let's say there were 8,000 acres of woodlands left at that time. At that rate of use, that 8,000 acres would have only lasted 10 more years from the 1790 census. So there's no wonder that we had this, that Thoreau described this moorland of vast shifting sands by 1850. Here's another piece of that coastal survey map. So interesting to blow up and look at. But I want to zoom in on some woodlots. This is a current photo with this is the 1960 lot divisions laid over a current aerial photo, or at least an aerial photo from the 2000s. And the width of these woodlots was somewhat determined by the quality of the wood. So if you had a homestead with really good woodland on it, then you'd only get a narrow strip of land. If you had really poor woodland, you get a wide strip of land, and whatever was needed to support your subsistence on the land. Some post-agricultural landscapes that were, these can be really nostalgic, and they can be, and the views were prized, but it was highly unnatural. So here's some woodlots that showed in North Truro on the Old Kings Highway. And I mapped those and compared them to a 2000 aerial photos from the 2000s. And I found that there's evidence of those same woodlot boundaries. Woods have grown in between them, but what we've gotten, and also those woodlots were kind of slightly matching the lot boundaries and on the tops between the hollows. So some interesting conclusions can be drawn about these ancient woodlots. But here they are now. The oak on the right side here would have been a woodlot that was never fully cleared, where the roots of the trees were not disturbed, and the pines on the other side would have been cleared completely, burned, maybe plowed. So when you walk through the old Kings Highway and you see these abrupt changes in the composition of the woods, there's a reason for that. It's land use. Also, the understory, you'll see places where there's no shrubs, where it's just grass, and that's very recent. Places with established understories are older, more established. And then these sort of wolf trees would have grown in the open. They would have had plenty of sunlight all around. And these split trees could have been coppiced. In other words, they were cut and allowed to regrow several times. So they were managed woodlot trees, a lot of these multi-stemmed oaks. And then there's fire scars that you might notice. And if you do walk a lot and you see these fire scars and keep track of them, I challenge you to figure out what side of the tree are they on, and do they all seem to be, because it makes sense that the prevailing wind would have pushed the fire in one direction. A lot of scars are buried inside the bark of the tree by now, but there's interesting observations. One thing I like to encourage is that if you make observations yourself consistently, then you can come up with a narrative of history and you can interpret the landscape. All right, again, I'm talking about land use still. Here's the railroad at Fisher Road in Truro. This photo, I think, is from, I'm not sure what year, but the bottom photo is 1992, and you can see how the woods have grown back. Thing about the railroads is every time the railroad went through, it started fires. And when they still burnt coal and stuff in the railroads, in the trains, they put up whenever the train had to climb even the slightest hill, it put off a lot of cinders that would start fires in its wake. And if you look through the town reports going back to the 1800s, the railroads are finished in 1870. So in each town, you'll see that there was a payment from the railroad to the town for fires. The railroad basically paid for its damages to every town. These are some, I went through some of those records and found any records I could of forest fires. At this time, there were very few roads and very few houses, and so fires could burn all the way from the bay to the ocean without really affecting much except for what was left of the forests. But those fires are a factor. And then, so here are the province lands. It's the 1838 map, but Steve Foreman from the University of Chicago did this study where he mapped the dune fronts over time and tried to estimate the velocity of those parabolic dunes in the province lands, how fast they were moving. So if you're not familiar with these parabolic dunes, they represent a disturbance, because if there was grass, dune grass, beach plum, if there were vegetation growing, they wouldn't be moving very fast. But when the dunes were stripped of their vegetation, the prevailing winds moved the sand in these parabolic shapes. There they are. They still exist. They're really fun to explore, and they create these groundwater wetland in their wake in the low points anyway, and the dune moves across those little wetlands, those bogs, those cranberry bogs, when it's active. Here's a windrose showing the prevailing winds that in March, based on, this is Logan Airport, but this shows when that sand would have been moving, which the spring storms and winter storms would have been driving that landscape. Thoreau came to Cape Cod in the 1850s. His book, Cape Cod, you probably may or may not have taken the time to read it. If you really need to be invited in, but it's amazingly, Thoreau's Cape Cod was written kind of as a series of comedy sketches. He wanted to entertain. They were lectures that he delivered, and they were kind of considered risque because of his attitudes about church and other things. But now they seem kind of dry. But anyway, they're really good. he has incredible insights into landscape processes. I also throw in Captain Penniman's wife here because to me, this represents this idea of bending the land to fit your lifestyle, to fit your life way. You know, these were whalers. They built this beautiful house in Eastham, and she seemed cool. You know, she left notebooks and photographs, but that was a time when we figured that using the landscape was good. And we would never use it up. We would never use it up, and we could live our lives in a way that might not be very responsive to the land. Let's see. Was I going to read something else? Well, I skipped a section of Thoreau's Cape Cod that describes that dune landscape of a sea of sand, where a figure on the horizon there was no scale to even determine how close or far that figure was. And really very stark and beautiful. And then the Old South Truro Meeting House, which for many years was like a ship on the ocean in that hogsback landscape of that part of Truro, visible all around. I always ride my bike up there and imagine it still being there. But, you know, that stark landscape where only a few trees are left in the hollows. So I've kind of talked about all this native settlement period where land was used kind of in a sustainable way. And there were park-like closed canopy forests. Then the colonial industrial period, deforestation and depletion, the draining of marshes. And then our contemporary period, what's going on? You know, one thing that's happened, we'll go back to this. Remind me about, I'll remember this. I have some slides later about now that we have a closed canopy forest again, which didn't happen for a couple hundred years after the trees were cut down. They didn't return until, you know, probably people alive today, their parents or grandparents remember seeing the bay and the ocean from a hilltop in Truro or Wellfleet, and the trees are back. So what does that mean for the ecology of the Cape? We'll talk about that. So then just a couple of place-based examples. We're all familiar with Champlain's beautiful maps. I'm just, whenever there's some evidence, whenever someone took the time to observe and record something, it's super valuable. And, you know, he included plants and animals, not all of which we can identify, respectful enough to pay attention to what the native people, their settlements, not respectful enough to avoid conflicts. But so this is our Nauset Marsh map by Champlain, 1604. Although it's not to scale, it's surprisingly full of detail that we recognize today in Nauset Marsh. But one thing I wonder about, and I think of that reference to paddling and to seafaring, I often wonder if this barrier beach was further out and there were sort of canoe pathways between Nauset Marsh and Pleasant Bay at that time, and that the waterways might have been more extensive for people who lived on the water. Salt Pond in the 60s, about the time when the seashore was created, and towards the 70s when trees are starting to come back, and Nauset Marsh in the distance, the visitor center when it was built, I think in the 70s, and a more recent picture of that visitor center. So, you know, we have the return of that canopy of forest. This was a transition period when salt marsh hay was still being collected. There's that boat in Eastham that you can go see that was a workboat on the marshes. The lighthouses are markers for coastal change. In this picture, gosh, let's see, these out of order. Anyway, these are the Three Sisters. These offshore are the locations of the Three Sisters, which were replaced by Nauset Lighthouse. Actually, here is the location of the Nauset Light, which was brought up from Chatham to replace the Three Sisters, and was itself moved in 1996 to this new location. And at the moment, well, you can see here, there's the new path to the beach, and the bathhouse and visitor building has been removed and is being rebuilt back here. And this Let's see, I think there might be another map. Yeah, so here's the 1960 Nauset Light parking lot, which is well over the cliff, the Three Sisters locations, the shorelines from 1890 to 2018. And even this lot now is gradually retreating. The Three Sisters are now back in the woods. So these calculations are hard to make. Highland Light, before it was moved, and after, here it is here. And I think I calculated there should be plenty of buffer zone for the new Highland Light location, but parts of this hole on the golf course are now undercut. So we got to constantly look at coastal change in terms of everything we do. Fort Hill, Bessie Penniman, and Doan Rock in Fort Hill, 1890s, I think, and 1992. That's me standing on the rock there. And at that time, this is what was left of the vegetation in Eastham. Here's Salt Pond, Fort Hill here. So Doan Rock would have been over here somewhere. But all these field boundaries with no vegetation at all. And of course, perfect for golf courses, which was part of the history of Eastham, pastures and golf courses. There, that's the original Three Sisters in the 1890s, and then the Nauset Light. And that's just another 1868 map of Fort Hill with its fields and pastures, a way of life that maintained those pastures, which is gone. So this is the current map showing the old woodlots that were left, and now rather suburban. Just a mention of Great Island and Wellfleet, which is interesting because for land use, because it was a protected area for sheep grazing. You know, you knew where your sheep were on an island, and the islands were barely connected to the land. This is the tavern site. The tavern was built on Great Island at a time when you could sit on the porch of the tavern and drink your ale and wait for the whales to drift in and run out and get them. The original, and also very, very heavily used by Wampanoag people at the time, well before the colonial period. This is a reconstruction I did of the original tavern, Great Island Tavern, based on the archaeological evidence. And the seashore is working with the tribe to excavate and preserve whatever artifacts are out there. Okay, just a few little then and now pictures. Bound Brook Island, you may have seen some of these photos. Again, 1910 maybe, and 1992 in the bottom. I did all these photos in 1992 when I went around and collected and did this then and now. There's me standing with my notebook at this marker, the woods on Bound Brook Island coming back. Pamet River, I feel like I'm taking too much time, so I'm going to rush through a little bit, but this is Ballstown, the cottage colony, the beach cottage colony on the Pamet part. And then one thing, I think, aside from this question about when we move things and how does that happen, we have enough information to know when, to give us plenty of lead time to move these structures off the beach, but we always hope that the trend will favor us somehow and give us more time. But one of the interesting things about Boston overwashes, the sand that's overwashed the dune there. First of all, storms are a good thing. Storms bring sand into the system, elevate the marsh in a way that will allow it to keep up with sea level rise. If there wasn't that sand, the marsh could be drowned. But then normally in a quieter time, this dune would be rebuilt by that river of sand that's moving along shore, adding sand in a quiet time. And in a couple of places like Boston Beach and Duck Harbor in Wellfleet, that hasn't been happening. But maybe we just need to wait longer. But the storms seem to be frequenter, and we need a little more of a time to measure that. Pamet River, looking at flooding, there's questions about the tide gate and why this flooding occurs. Inland flooding, stormwater drainage is really significant, and does question about whether that seawater floods the system and can't get out. Do we need to open up Route 6? And then we also mapped the location of all the houses to see whose well and septic system might be at risk. Very few really are. Most of them are outside the floodplain in the Pamet. A few more pictures. Pamet, 1910, 1992. These are just kind of dramatic and fun. The Cranberry House at North Pamet, Horseleech Pond, Higgins Pond, I think, Gull Pond, Sluiceway. And then the failed housing development at High Head called Pilgrim Heights, where they were marketing those little lots that eventually were protected by the seashore. So what's to come? One thing really useful to gauge the future is to look at the FEMA flood maps and look at, they're updating these maps all the time. They're bad news for homeowners who have to pay flood insurance, but they're a really good guide for where flooding might occur. Again, we want to avoid surprises and use information that we can get. So we got Provincetown, Wellfleet, Nauset, and Eastham. Also, we're expecting the plant hardiness zones, which have always been a guide for gardeners and farmers, to migrate. One of my favorite books is a book called The Natural History of the Future by Rob Dunn. Really interesting read. And he says, most species on Earth will have to move to survive climate change. Now he's talking about most species. He's talking about plants, animals, in order for them to continue their lifestyle in their ecological niche. That niche is moving, the sweet spot of climate is moving, and all kinds of animals are dependent on those habitats. And not only, this is, I could explain this further, but basically there's two concerns here. These are some of our endemics. The spadefoot toad and the hognose snake are very special Cape Cod residents that are rare elsewhere, but quite common here because of the sandy habitats and the particular climate in the wetlands. Changes in climate will impact them, and maybe we'll lose some of these special characters, but we're not going to lose these. The rats, the rock doves are actually, favored by the urban corridors, by urbanization, and there's lots more to be said about that. And then our other wildlife, the ones on the left here are already our neighbors. Coyotes, foxes, fishers. I'm not saying all of these other characters on the right are coming to Cape Cod, but some are more likely than others to come now that we have this closed canopy forest, now that we have habitats and corridors. And I don't think it's such a bad thing, but I think we are going to have to be more aware of our trash, of how we interact with animals, not feeding them, not taming them. Probably unlikely that we'll get mountain lions. We have had a bear visit, bobcats, porcupines, beavers, possible. And finally, let's see, Harvard design students, I think this is a really interesting exercise. They took the Provincetown waterfront and they were encouraged to be super creative and come up with future versions after sea level rise of what a waterfront community might look like. And, some of these solutions with houses on stilts, elevated above the flood levels, are probably a transition to a future where the shoreline is in a different place. Other solutions like this, where islands are built offshore, are not really were very well informed by the facts of science, in that this sediment, whatever sand you need to build islands to allow people to keep their houses in the same place, it's simply not available. There's a tight system of physics that's moving that sand around, and any system, the way that we live is determined by nature, by how these forces move, as I've mentioned a few times. So expanding flood zones, changes in the sediment budgets. I'm not going to read all this, but these are some of our vulnerabilities. Pond warming, eutrophication, loss of low marsh, forest change. Some of the changes in the forest and the changes in winter temperatures might bring us more ticks, more mosquitoes, changes in the wetlands. Really important to manage our wetlands well. Changes in wildlife, and keep an eye. This is too much. I'm not going to read it, but we can talk about it. But a couple of points, though, there will always be a beach, even as the shoreline retreats. Beaches will build. There's plenty of sediment moving along the shoreline to build new beaches in new places. And we need to free the beach and allow that sand to deposit and not build structures that stop the movement of sand. Also, these are a couple of things I referred to in making this talk. Some of my faves. And obviously, there's a long bibliography of things that you might enjoy reading about landscape, about coastal geology and history. But I mentioned Dawnland Voices, Indigenous Anthology. There's this, the New English Canaan of Samuel Morton, which is a really interesting account paralleling the Pilgrim accounts about, with good descriptions of the landscape and how people used it. Thoreau's Cape Cod, the Kettle Pond Atlas, which I think you can download from the National Seashore website, and the Cape Cod Commission has another atlas which shows pond depths, trends in temperature and water quality. A book that I helped with, this is an ebook, USGS Circular 1417. You can search for it and download it for free. John Kumbler's Cape Cod Environmental History, and the book I mentioned, The Natural History of the Future by Rob Dunn. And then I also mentioned this one website, the CZM Storm Smart Coasts website. And thank you. I went on a little longer than I hoped, but I'm gonna turn it back over to Susan.
Thank you so much, Mark. I don't know if people can see my face or not. Let's see. No, can you see me? Anyway, thank you very much. And we do have some questions. Can you hear me, Mark? Because I can't see myself. So one of the questions was about hemlock trees. Pat Rooney was wondering, were hemlock trees native to the Cape? And what you might know about them?
I would say that they were part of the forest composition in that period of boreal forest thousands of years ago. You know, basically the forest that you see in Maine and in Canada and in Central Mass would have been part of the forest here at a time when it was still colder. Yeah. But, you know, this question of what's native is a good one, because is it native now? I wouldn't say that we would recreate that boreal forest landscape of the glacial period now and call it sustainable, because, you know, nature has already decided what's, you know, what habitat we have now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let me see. There was a bunch of talk really through your talk about the Three Sisters, because you didn't explain what they were. And so people have commented that the Three Sisters were the earlier lighthouses before Nauset Light was brought up from Chatham, and that Chatham Light used to be 2 towers. Naomi Olson asks, could you please re-show your maps of the railroad-induced forest fires and say what the thin green lines on that map represent?
Okay, let's see if I can go to that. Yeah, it's kind of getting there. There it is. Okay.
I think you have to share your screen again.
Is it? I'm not sharing anymore?
Because I'm not seeing it.
Okay. Let me share. Okay.
Oh, great.
Okay, so let's see. So we have the Cape Cod outline. We have these different colored, this is really a sketchy map, I'm sorry, but these colored polygons are the fire footprint. And then Route 6 here in the middle. And actually these little these little fan-shaped things are views. These are actually the views of the photographs that I showed, those then and now photographs. So there are viewpoints for looking at landscape history. Now, green line. Anyway, that's basically what's on here.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Another question was, people have questions, of course, about the future of the Willamette Basin and what you expect to happen there.
Well, I think the town looks favorably on reintroducing natural tidal flow to the Upper Willamette. The Army Corps of Engineers did an original sort of proposal for a new culvert under Route 6 in 1999 and recommended a new study. And that study was partially done by the Corps recently, but the results were incomplete. But basically, with the proper study, and I think, I'm only speaking from what I know, but I think once what they would want to do is, first of all, determine the elevation of the wells and septic systems in the Upper Willamette, and then create a new culvert to bring salt water into the Upper Willamette that wouldn't create conflicts for existing home sites. Now, what that would mean, and I'm sure before they do this, there's going to be a lot of discussion within the town and people would have an opportunity to weigh in. But the one thing it would mean is a change from freshwater wetland in the Upper Willamette to saltwater system. And there's a lot of good reasons to do that. But there are thoughtful people on both sides of that issue who might prefer that it not be changed. But, the way these things are done is to lay out the benefits and costs and let everyone ask those questions as it goes.
Right. Thank you. Thanks so much. You've gotten a lot of praise so far. Stephen Broker says, talks often get praise, but this was an extraordinary talk, rapid fire and loaded with much important information. Thank you. And Sarah Walters suggests that we have a part 2. And
thank you, Sarah.
yeah. Torben Jenk asks, are the 19th century coastal survey maps of Cape Cod online?
They are. They're available to download through the archives of NOAA, National Ocean Service. I wonder if, let's see, the copies I have, I could provide them to the Historical Society. I could even, if people send me an email address, I could try to send some files of those. They're broken up by town. But yeah, I'd be happy to try to send a few out, if not everyone asks.
Well, what you could do maybe is to send it to director@trurohistoricalsociety.org, and then people who would like it can contact our director through the email, and we can make the connection that way.
Great.
Russ Braun was asking about a specific map also. He thought a map early on, like 5 minutes in, was gorgeous, but I don't know which one that was. So maybe maybe Russ, you could send an email, or you can just put something in the chat right now.
Actually, I'm going to zoom to this map. I don't know if anyone's interested in this map. There are copies of it at the Schoolhouse Gallery. They're prints that are about 2 or 3 feet, 2 feet, 2-foot prints. And we're also offering these as a benefit. I don't have the details in front of me, but anyway, if you're interested in that, you can also email me or contact the Schoolhouse Gallery.
Okay, that's fine. There was another question about Pilgrim Lake. Will it be restored?
And again, that's a question between the town, the community, and I think there is a consensus to do it. The story of Pilgrim Lake is that it was closed. It was it used to be a big open estuary with the mouth was right at the Provincetown border. It was hundreds of meters wide. and it was closed for the railroad and the highway, and various history happened. There's only a 6-foot culvert that's actually being restored right now down near Moon Pond, near that town landing. You'll notice the trucks. And there's a lot of interest in expanding that 6-foot culvert so that we'd actually get a tidal signal in Pilgrim Lake, East Harbor. It became saltwater again. At some point, the tide gate broke and saltwater came in the 90s. And so it's been saltwater for a while. It's sort of adjusted, but it really needs a full flushing in order. But there are horseshoe crabs in there. There's a lot of progress in the, fauna and flora coming back to Pilgrim Lake. So a lot of these projects, they're kind of a matter of time and energy at the town and at the seashore and in the community. How many projects can we handle all at once? But if you go and ask in town hall, I think you'll get a positive response.
Thank you. There was also another question about were there lasting effects from the canal that crossed the Cape by the Orleans traffic circle? Is there still a waterway through that area? And that's from Stephen Cohen.
Jeremiah's Gutter. It's referred to, see, Thoreau talks about it. Through history, there has been high water that I'm not sure if I believe that you could navigate it from the bay to the ocean through there, but as sea level rises, you never know. And I haven't looked in detail at that, but I'll tell you what's interesting is, where did the marshes go when sea level rises? Because we've built up to the margins of a lot of our marshes and a lot of our bays. And so, as the water overtops these roads, as houses might become in the flood zone, then it'll come to you at town meeting or through projects. Do we want to buy out the house? Do we want to create conservation land, move the road? Those are tough, but that's something that's definitely on the table in the next 50 years, is reconfiguring our waterfronts to allow the wetlands to move upland.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think that we could have another webinar with no problem at all. So let's talk about that and have what somebody called a part 2. I wanted to just say a couple of things, and that is, first of all, thank everybody for coming. We really appreciate it. And we are recording this webinar, and it will be available on our website within a day or two. They usually give us the recording, and we will also add it to our YouTube channel, which you can go to YouTube and put our name in, and you can come up with all the webinars that we've had over the past year and a half since COVID started, and send us into the webinar area. And I wanted to just let you all know that our next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, April 13th, and it's going to be Truro shipwrecks with Dan Sanders, who is our shipwreck expert at the Highland House Museum. And so that should be really, really interesting. And I hope a lot of you will join us for that as well. And I just want to thank you all for coming and wish you all a wonderful evening. Thanks very much. And good evening.